Gentlemen, welcome to the Be the Man podcast. I'm your host, Greg Denning. Today, my guest is Aaron Asay, and he and I met you in Tennessee, but I didn't get to know you until we were on a quick disaster relief trip to Cuba, which I don't know, we don't have time for all that, but for both of us, we've traveled all over, but for both of us, Cuba was special, man. That country is awesome. Anyways, we got to spend a lot of hours together and got to know each other. So
that's another podcast.
Yeah, exactly. That's another one for that whole story. But thanks for being on here, brother. I'm super excited to have this conversation and learn from your experience.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Give us a little bit of your background and story, just so we can get to know you a little bit, and then we're gonna dive into all kinds of fun topics.
Okay. Not sure how far back you want me to go, but I'm currently working for an NGO, a non-government organization that specializes in disaster recovery and anti-human trafficking. And I've been with them for almost a year now. I'm the chief medical officer and the director of anti-human trafficking. I came to this job after being a physician assistant for most recently 6 years, running a medical clinic in rural Maui. And when people hear me say rural Maui, they think, oh, yeah, you're in Hawaii. There's, it's just like tourists and waterfalls and coconuts. And well, we were on a part of the island that is, it takes some stamina to get to because it's a very long, very windy, treacherous road, isolated from the rest of the island with a 2-hour trip to the nearest hospital. So running a clinic out there was a constant adventure and sometimes tragic. So I spent the last 6 years doing that with my family, graduated 3 of my kids from that little school in that town of about 2,000 people. So it was a very small town, small school, small town life. But it was old Hawaiian life. So we were very immersed in the Polynesian culture. And now we're missing it a lot because we're not there anymore. We've had to relocate to Nashville, Tennessee, which is home now, but we're constantly thinking about our home back there and constantly staying in contact with those friends. I'm the father of 4 children. I'm married to my lovely wife, Amy. And she's been my partner in crime and my partner in adventure for 27 years now. This year was our 27th anniversary, which we're pretty proud of because
That is awesome.
We're finding out how rare that is because we have so many friends that haven't reached that number. And it's been an amazing journey. It's been incredible experiences that we've been able to share, which has grown our relationship and allowed us to grow together, as husband and wife, but also as parents.
We got to circle back to that because as we get more into your story and all the things you've done and the big adventures and changes in businesses and all this stuff, like circling back, we'll circle back to that because 27 years.
Okay.
Because that's huge. That is huge to stay in that. It's not like you guys just picked one little path and just followed this little path. You guys, you've lived, man. And to stay with the stability of the marriage in all the changes of life, that's pretty awesome. It's very awesome.
Greg, you're absolutely right. There's when I mentioned 27 years of marriage and people think, wow, that's a long time. But going through my head is 27 years of some incredible highs, some of the deepest lows, some of the most heartbreaking experiences, and some of the most amazing things that could ever happen to a person. And there's so much that goes into that 27 years.
Dude, you need to write a book, bro. As I'm just sitting here thinking of what little I know, I'm like, you got to write a book. You got to capture so many of your stories. Okay, my wife bought me a how-to book just recently. It's entitled "Just Shut Up and Write the Damn Book." Yep.
I think I just added "damn," but I think
that's even a better title.
But that's how I read it, right? I'm like, okay.
That is awesome.
But yeah, we've in that 27 years, we've had multiple careers. I was a firefighter paramedic for a little while. We owned a bike shop for a while.
Okay, wait, we got to pause there. Sorry, we got to pause there because while we were in Cuba, realized that when you owned that bike shop, I started doing triathlons.
That's right.
You and I met at this little triathlon in this little mountain town somewhere, and I just had this connection. Then I realized you and I had crossed paths just for
That's
Instagram.
right.
We talked for a little bit, for a few minutes, and connected a couple triathlons, and then that was it. But then to reconnect in Cuba, I forgot about that right now.
That's right. I forgot about that too. That was at one of the Chris Bowerbank races. That was up at was it Pinedale, Arizona?
Yep, Pineview.
Pineview, yeah. That was so my little bike shop was the designated bike mechanic, course mechanic. So we would drive around and help fix bikes, and we were there at the finish line and the transition area to help people with mechanical problems with their bikes. And yeah, we'd take a little gear to sell, and yeah, it was an amazing time. I joke about how many years it took off the other end of my life by doing that for 10 years, but it was a pretty incredible experience to share with my wife and I. But yeah, we did that. And before that, we worked, I worked as an EMT and mountain safety at Sundance Ski Resort for a number of years. We were in Utah for a long time. We were there for about 20 years before we moved to Hawaii. So we had a lot of our experiences in that area. We initially, all our kids were born at Utah Valley Regional Medical Center in Provo. So we've got a 24-year-old, a 21-year-old, a 19-year-old, and a 15-year-old still at home, about to turn 16 this year. So we're almost empty nesters. We got a few more years to go, but we're both excited and not about being empty nesters. Our kids are everything to us. They're our number one source of joy and inspiration, and we're so excited for them launching. But at the same time, it's hard to see them go. You know how that is. It's
same, man. Our first two. The next year so quickly. And just a quick background too, like share some of the adventures you've done, from dog sledding to you've done some massive ice climbing, rock climbing. You've done some big adventures and been around the world as well.
Yeah, it's funny actually. I've always been a mountain person. I was raised in Southern California, but my father, he was my scoutmaster. So, and he was always a mountain guy. He was always an outdoorsman. So he was kind of your quintessential sort of mountain man, but also waterman. So he taught me both to love the ocean and the mountains. So growing up in Southern California, I spent a lot of time in the Angeles Crest, just climbing along that the coastal range of mountains, and we would go as scouts. But he also, as a scout troop, he got us all certified in scuba diving, and so we spent our summer camps going scuba diving around the Channel Islands and spending a lot of time in the ocean and sailing. We had a sailboat when I was a child, and so I learned how to sail at a very young age and did that pretty much all growing up. But my last 2 years of high school, we moved away from Southern California to Seattle, Washington, a little town called Redmond. And up there, I learned more about the mountains. I became much more of a mountain guy because I learned to ski up there, and I learned to climb initially. And I had friends that were really into cycling. So that was actually where I developed my love for road cycling, which ended up coming back years later, coming back around to being something I completely dedicated part of my life to, was riding bicycles. So, which is kind of funny in that regard. But when we were in Utah, Amy and I actually met in the mountains. And before we got married, I was very into rock climbing. We were living in Provo, and that was kind of all I did. In fact, it was, to the detriment of my schooling and work. I would go up to the mountains and rock climb almost every day. So it's kind of
Man, I spent
I
my
was a
whole
rock
college
climber,
years
yeah.
on a mountain bike or rock climbing in a harness.
Yeah, or skiing. So I got kicked out of Rick's College because I never went to school. I had a job up at Grand Targhee in their ski school, and yeah, I failed all my classes that second semester during the ski season. So I I ended up they told me, hey, if you would like to come back here to go to school, we recommend you go serve a mission. Otherwise, you're not welcome. Like, okay, I guess I'm never coming back here, because at that time I hadn't planned on, serving a mission and committing myself in that way to the gospel like I have. But yeah, so yeah, skiing and rock climbing and just being outdoors and backpacking, and later on the dog sledding thing, which is a whole other that could almost be a whole other podcast in itself, really. Came about just because of not just my love for the outdoors, but what became my family's love for the outdoors and being outside and connecting with our natural environment and with the animals that live there. And yeah, it's been a pretty amazing thing. In fact, one of our sort of routines every year, traditions, was for us to go up and climb in the Grand Tetons. And we would try and get up there at least once every year. And that started from about the year we got married. We tried to get up there and spend at least a little bit of time up there. That was kind of our recharge place, just get as high up and as rugged as you can get. But
let's dive in, because like there's the you've just been active, like really living out and doing things. But healthy and fit as well, and then go into the medical, and then deep into medical. Let's go into that for a little bit. That was one of the main reasons I want to talk to you. Is we had some conversations about health and fitness, and I wanted to share some of your background in that, specifically around like food and nutrition and fitness. Like you stayed in fantastic shape. And how old are you again, brother?
I just had the second anniversary of my 49th birthday.
Yeah, buddy. That's awesome. Okay. And you're still in fantastic shape, where a lot of guys are like, oh, I'm getting older, and just kind of let things go. And they
Yeah.
Lots of excuses or whatever. Let's talk health, fitness, and nutrition.
Okay. Yeah, fitness has always been something very, very important to me. I had some health problems throughout my young adulthood. I spent some time with some what were supposedly very benign cancers in my nose that ended up being somewhat more severe, and I ended up having to have multiple surgeries and fixing some of the infrastructure that holds my face together. And that was kind of scary. That was when I was in my late 20s. And then I had an injury that became a pretty severe back problem. So I walked with a cane for a number of months, bent over. And that was my sort of introduction to my mortality, that I could be disabled. In fact, I was told by my orthopedic surgeon at the time, not the one that did my back surgery, but the surgeon that I had previously gone to, said, there's a very high likelihood that you will never be able to pick up anything heavier than your infant baby, which was my oldest son at the time, meaning more than 10 or 15 pounds. And he said, there's not a likelihood that you're going to ever get any stronger than that. So of course I got a new doctor because I wasn't willing to accept that. Neither was my wife. And I had dreams at that point to be a fireman. That was, for me, a really, really big deal, because, I fast forwarded a number of years in that story, but I had, at that point, we'd already had the bike shop for a while. I'd spent a number of years, being very active and trying to be as fit as I can. And then that happened. So it was a pretty scary time. And we found another surgeon. I was able to get a surgery that was not experimental, but it was a sort of a roll of the dice whether or not it was going to be successful. And it took a while, about a year afterwards, before I was able I wouldn't say be pain free, because I've never been pain free my whole life, but to be able to go back to normal activity. And the funny thing is after the surgery, I trusted the doctor so much. And even though I was still in pain and having a hard time, like getting my strength and my fitness and my overall, body strength back, I still managed to sneak into a firefighter slot. So I was recently, and I thought it would be disqualifying. So I hid it from the fire department when I first got hired. I didn't tell them that I had just, what was it, 9 months earlier, had back surgery.
Oh yeah, that would have been a disqualifier right away.
So yeah, but somehow I managed to pass the firefighter fitness test, but I was still in the process of gaining my strength back. But I had so much trust and faith that I was going to be fine that I didn't ever question it. We just went full force forward trying to get this job, because I knew I was supposed to be a firefighter. I put myself through paramedic school. Well, Amy and I put ourselves through paramedic school specifically to do that. And it was actually during paramedic school that I had the injury and was walking with the cane. And it was, oh man, I mean, thinking, even going back to that time, it's just how hopeless it felt, thinking that my body was that broken. Right. But becoming a fireman, I was able to really focus on fitness. And over the years of being a fireman, that was about the time that CrossFit started coming out and gaining popularity. And so we really got into exercising that way. The bike shop also was kind of a part of our lives at the time, and we were spending a lot of time around really good athletes. I had trained to do an Ironman when I graduated from college a few years prior, and I continued trying to keep that sort of fitness level, or trying to get it back, and then trying to maintain that fitness level of being able to compete. We even did, after I became a fireman, we started doing the adventure races. So we were doing these like 3 to 5 day long, 24 hours a day adventure races, where you could actually be asked to be on like any mode of transportation, from walking on your feet to riding a bike to kayaking to carrying your bicycle all strapped down to a canoe, across the lake. Like, it was everything you could imagine. And it was all an attempt to push myself, improve myself, that I was fit enough to be doing what I was doing. I'm also, constantly looking for adventure. So it was also kind of a way to do that, of course. But it became a sort of a family thing too. We got really involved with the endurance sports, the industry at that time. I got to meet all these big name athletes. And so they were very inspiring to me to try to push myself to be as fit as I possibly could. And, funny thing, going back to what you were talking about nutrition wise, thinking that I would be a better athlete if I changed my nutrition and focused on my diet. And during this time, so this was like early 2000s, and there was a lot of, well, like it is now, there were a lot of differing, like we had South Beach diet, and we had the Mediterranean Blue Zones. Was the study came out was really big that time. This was before we found out how much of it was a lie. And so we decided to become vegetarians, and I
tried that too.
We were like 6 years as vegetarians, thinking that we were really doing something right. And the really funny thing is I didn't notice just how bad it was for my health, because I was exercising so much. But looking back on it, I realized it was a constant effort to try and just maintain my muscle mass. So yeah, I was doing a lot of endurance sports. So I could not put on muscle to save my life. I was just this kind of string bean the whole time. And yeah, it was great for cycling, but it was not great for what I got into later on, which was like combat sports and stuff. I got really into Krav Maga later on. That's another story we can talk about later. But I had basically no armor. I had no muscle on my body to protect my body. So if I'd fall off my bike or something, man, I was hurt. And my wife had the same problem. She actually developed really severe anemia and ended up like being a extremely high risk pregnancy during this time. And her obstetrician was like, you have to start eating meat or you're going to need a blood transfusion. She just was incredulous, right? So here we were just, doing our best. I mean, really eating what we thought was very, very clean. We were juicing, we were eating tons of leafy greens, mostly kale. I remember one day funny side note, I was juicing the leafy greens, and I was juicing a lot of kale. And you know how kale and mustard greens kind of look similar? I had, I had juiced like a gallon of mustard green thinking it was kale. And I was all done. I had this big old, and I went to take this gigantic swig. I mean, I was gulping it, and I realized like halfway through the glass that it was mustard green. It took me a while to get over that.
Not bad.
Yeah, it burned really bad. But so funny thing, I had a friend who was a rancher, and he raised this hybrid cattle called beefalo. Have you heard of the beefalo? It's a buffalo and a beef cow hybrid.
Yeah.
And it's not 50-50. I don't remember exactly what the ratio is, but yeah, the whole herd of these cattle, they're huge. They kind of look like a gigantic cow, super muscular. And if from a distance you'll be like, is that a buffalo? No, there's no hump, but it's just this big, massive cow. And supposedly you get all the benefits of the buffalo meat, which is a little bit leaner and a little bit, the cholesterol ratio is a little bit different, although the risk and whatnot about cholesterol is kind of arguable at this point. But it's the same flavor as a beef cow. So it's not the buffalo kind of a little bit, buffalo, if you eat straight buffalo, it's kind of got that little bit of a gamey taste, whereas the bison and the hybrids don't. So we're on a father and son's camp out, right? So I'm out there with my boys, and he brought a whole bunch of ground beefalo. And he actually, not long after this, opened up a restaurant called Bomb Diggities, which served only beefalo meat. So beefalo burgers, right? It's not there anymore, unfortunately. But so he says, hey, Aaron, I'll make you a deal. If you'll eat one of my burgers, I promise you will stop being vegetarian. I'm like, there's no way. And there's no way I'll do it. And he had brought this up before because he and I were serving in the scouts together. And he a few times had said, hey, you should quit being a vegetarian and come back to real life. And of course I'm like, oh yeah, you're just this, you're just a, farm, backwoods farm boy, what do you know? And so I kept telling Doug, no, I'm not going to stop being a vegetarian. I'm going to keep eating clean and I'm doing the right thing. So we're at this camp and I don't know what got into me. I'm just like, what? I'm going to prove him wrong. And I'm probably going to be super sick. And that's okay. He's going to see me vomit violently and the whole matter will be put to rest. So he hands me the burger and I take a bite and it was like I bit into heaven. It was so delicious. And all of a sudden, my body felt energized from that first bite. And I'm sitting there going, I need more. Like, I need another bite. So I finished the whole burger and I even had a second one. And after it was over, I was waiting expectantly to be violently ill. Because that's what everybody says, if you're a vegetarian and you eat meat, you're going to throw it all up and it's terrible and you don't ever want to do that. Well, it's all a lie. It's not true. Your body craves meat. Now I know that. So I waited for the the stomach aches and never came. Went to bed, felt fine. Woke up the next morning and he's cooking up some of the meat as sausage, for the meal, for the breakfast meal. And I had eggs and beefalo sausage for breakfast that morning. So that trip was the end of me being a vegetarian. I came home and told my wife, I'm like, this is it. We're done. We are now meat eaters. And we started buying meat again. I didn't know to what degree we needed to actually progress to that then, because this was a number of years ago. I just knew we needed to add meat into our diet, and we did. We actually, still ate very clean, and we tried to include vegetables as often as possible. And there were times where I would go whole meals without eating meat, certainly, but there was meat in our diet pretty much every day. And a lot of those little health problems that were nagging us, and like her anemia, those things resolved. And she started feeling better. She stopped being a high-risk pregnancy. Our children were born no problem. She solved those anemia problems and probably some vitamin disorders from her going back to eating meat. So fast forward now, I'm deployed for COVID back in 2019. And, we'd always been fairly clean eaters. Like, we'd always tried to eat organic. We would try to avoid as much as possible the processed foods, but we were using like a lot of olive oil, and we would use other seed oils just because, not really paying attention if we were eating processed foods, what was in them. So I get deployed, and the military is providing all of our meals. And I was getting these meals. And so we're in Hawaii, and I'm getting like these basically bento boxes, right, with some meat and like this gigantic pile of rice and some sort of vegetable. And I was just getting more and more frustrated with these meals because I could tell I was just feeling terrible. I was having these really bad like arthritic pains in my legs, which I just attributed it to being older. I've dealt with people in my clinic with the same problems. They get older, they get pain in their legs and their arms, and you just tell them to, it's probably arthritis, and you need to exercise more and drink lots of water and, take ibuprofen when it hurts really bad, but there's not much you can do about it. So I didn't really believe what I was saying, because I thought there had to be a solution, especially as the pain was getting unbearable. I'd sit down in a chair for a few minutes, and I would have to stand up and wait a second before I could take steps because it hurt so bad. So I knew there was something wrong. And I started thinking, well, maybe I've got rheumatoid arthritis. Like, I started going down all these different pathways, neuropathy. Like, there's definitely something going on with me. And I was talking to a friend who was a cardiologist, because I started doing some research. And, back in 2019, we were now starting to see some of the guys being more outspoken about carnivorism and carnivore whole food diets. Yep. And that, for some reason, that like triggered something in my head that I needed to pay attention to that. I need to look at this. I need to figure out why these guys can be online saying what they're saying, solving my problems. Because one of the guys, Sean Baker, was specifically talking about how he had been developing some pains in his legs, and being a carnivore for 6 years helped it. And he was in his early 40s at that time. And then there was this other doc, Dr. Saladino, was talking about really severe skin problems, arthritis, all kinds of things that he had cured with going animal-based whole food. So I was talking to this cardiologist. I'm like, Doc, what do you think? I mean, we talk about keto diets, and we talk about all these different methods to help people lose weight. And I said, from a cardiologist perspective, what do you really think about nutrition? He goes, Aaron, I have no idea, really. I wasn't trained on that in school. And I just send them to the nutritionist because I don't know. But I can tell you that what we know about cholesterol, and what we know about atherosclerotic heart disease or arteriosclerotic heart disease, and what we know about our nutrition's impact on that is messed up, is wrong, is mistaken, is like, there are so many conflicting studies and so many conflicting data sets that it's really hard to say with any certainty what's real and what's not right now. He said, at the same time, you and I can both agree that the nutrition industry is messed up too. Like, it's business. Yep. And in any business, what drives business? Not truth, but money. Yep. What drives business? Whatever is going to solve the balance sheet, whatever is going to make that business more successful. That is what's going to be most important to the business. And nutrition is just that. And even our nutrition education industry has become big business. So he and I chatted quite a bit because we were running, I'm embarrassed to say, we were running the COVID vaccine clinics together in Maui. And looking back on it now, I'm floored at how we were influenced in such an easy way to be supporting all that happened during that time, even though there were so many red flags. And that's another story for another time. And I'm not saying, I'm antagonistic to vaccine, but COVID was a mess. Yep. And I was in the middle of it. And at the same time, my body felt like it was breaking down. So I decided while I was out there, I'm going to do something different. I'm going to do something drastic. I'm going to try something that seems to be so out there that everybody's going to call me crazy. And even my family will probably call me crazy, but I got to try this because I've been living healthy. Here we've been living in rural Maui, eating off the land, eating local, food, mostly vegetables and fruit, but meat and just whatever, and yet I'm having these problems. So I decided I was going to go strict carnivore. So I did it for, what would you say? I probably did it for a few months of just eating only meat and nothing else.
Wow.
And I never went through, people talk about, you go through the meat sweats and you get the terrible diarrhea, and never happened. Like I felt great from day one. I stopped eating vegetables. Okay, I'm going to get a little bit explicit right now. I stopped eating vegetables, but I'm a medical provider, so I can talk about this stuff and nobody should bat an eye. In medicine, when we talk about digestion, we have what's called a Bristol stool chart. And the Bristol stool chart is like this chart that has the different types of stool that can come out your butt and land in the toilet, from diarrhea to little rocky pellets, like what deer leave behind, and every variation in between. And that's something that it's a tool that we use with patients to determine, well, what category of stool do you have and what's normal? And normal poop should be like formed into like one log, not be sticky, be easy to wipe. And in fact, if you can wipe and nothing really comes off the paper, that's probably the healthiest stool you could possibly have. So what I noticed was all of a sudden the stool changed to the same every day, to having more no wipe poops. Like you go sit in the toilet and you don't even need the paper. Like you wipe and you're like, I just wasted some paper because there's nothing there. And that became more frequent and more normal to where now that's what's normal. Never had that on a vegetarian diet for sure. No way. Gas, flatulence, farts, which goes along with a vegetarian diet. You just expect that you're going to be farty. Yep. Vegetarians expect that they're going to bloat periodically throughout the day after each meal. That disappears. So why?
You've been taught that that's normal and natural.
Yeah, it's not. Your body's not supposed to be farty. Your body is supposed to give off some gas, but not constantly throughout the day. And it's not supposed to smell rancid, which is what happens when people eat nothing but vegetables. Like they stink, right? And they're constantly like giving off gas. Like you go to a vegetarian yoga retreat, dude, you almost can't handle being in the same room because it's just constant, and it's just it's so malodorous that you just like, I got to get out of here. It's different with a carnivore yoga retreat. No, I'm kidding. I've never been on a carnivore yoga retreat, but I bet it would be quite pleasant. So first of all, the stool changes, the bloating goes away. And then I started questioning, well, that's weird. If I'm eating something that's unhealthy, shouldn't those things persist? Shouldn't I be feeling terrible? No, I started feeling better. The pains in my legs were lessening. They didn't go away, but I was able to stand up and walk without having to wait till the blood flow came back, till the pain kind of subsided, and that has just slowly gotten better until today. It's gone. I don't have that anymore, right? And while we're not 100% carnivore anymore, we are what I call animal-based whole foods. So what I did during that time, and this was what we slowly did as a family, is not only did we eliminate the vegetables, which there is a lot to this, and we can unpackage it if you want, but vegetables are toxic, and that's not arguable. Any botanist, any biologist that's worth their salt in biology will agree that plants have evolutionarily developed toxins to protect themselves. We know that. The question is, what is the quantity that's actually poisonous to humans? Well, if you set that aside for just a second and look at the other question, what quantity of plants is required to supply the human with the nutrients that the human needs? So if I need all the B vitamins, and if I need all the trace minerals, and everything that comes out of a plant, and I need this quantity, how much of that quantity is required for me to get all the nutrients I need in a given day? Okay, so now let's take that quantity and compare it to how much is actually poisonous of those plants that you eat. And we start coming to an interesting conclusion. You have to eat such massive quantities of plant foods to even give you, let's just talk B vitamins, to even give you sufficient B vitamins to not be deficient. Now the toxin is causing you problems, most likely, because it's massive, massive quantities. In fact, you have to eat all day. But what do you get from red meat? You get your recommended daily allowance in just a single slice of red meat, and you eat a couple meals with that, and you're getting every nutrient that the body needs just in that one small meal. So now all these calories that you would be consuming.
Sorry to interrupt. It's not the same with white meat, right? Just because you specifically mentioned red meat, and I want to kind of make that point clear. It's the red meat has that nutrient density.
Yeah. White meat doesn't have the nutrient density. It doesn't have the enough quantities of fat, which the body needs. The animal fat is a very important source of fuel for our bodies. White meat we consider, and I'm talking about chicken especially, white meat we consider a junk meat. So it's the meat that's not ideal, which is, to me, the junk foods are anything that's not ideal for the body. And what is ideal for the human body? Well, what's the ideal food for our species? You can take any species on the planet and figure out pretty easily what the ideal food is, because most animals on our planet have one ideal food source. In other words, there aren't very many omnivores on the planet, first of all. But also even omnivores there's one type of food that they gravitate towards, and predominantly that's 95% of what they eat. But for some reason, human hubris has told us that we can eat anything we want and we will thrive on whatever we want to eat. But that doesn't make biological sense, right? That doesn't make evolutionary sense. You don't just evolve to eat everything. There has to be something that's ideal. Yep. There has to be, for our organism, an ideal source of food. So now we get into the question of, well, what is that? Is that ideal source of food vegetarian? Is it all vegetables? Is that ideal source of food all meat? Well, you can look at the anthropological evidence. You can compare things like stomach acidity. You can look at teeth. You can look at how we digest, how we process. You can look at the fact that we're hunters. How we metabolize, how our energy allows us to gather food, how we are more accustomed, our bodies are more designed to hunt down game and prey than it is to gather wheat in the field. Things like our stomach acidity, which makes us more like carrion eaters. We're scavengers. Like, our stomach acidity is designed to eat stuff that's rancid. So we don't need that to process vegetables. We do need that to process rancid meats. So, what's the other one? Our teeth. Our teeth are designed to cut. Our teeth are designed to grind. Our teeth are designed to smash and rip apart. They're not designed to grind fiber. We know they're not. You compare them to the fiber grinding animals, yep. Your herbivores, they're not the same in any way. Right. You can't, if you bite down, you can't move your teeth side to side. But when you watch a cow sit and chew the cud, what do?
Yeah.
Right? Our teeth don't do that. Our teeth go straight up and down. So what does that do? Well, it smashes the food into smaller pieces and it rips apart all the little connective tissue. So it's for bone and gristle and the things that are hard to rip apart and then digest. It's not the same with plant fibers like your stems and leaves and things like that. So, and there's a lot more to it, definitely. And I would never consider myself an expert in this area. This is just from things that I've read, but also more than anything, it's my anecdotal evidence using myself, my family. I had some patients that came to me on their own wanting to try an animal-based whole food diet. And I had 3 patients reverse diabetes. And I'm talking going from an A1C, which is how if somebody has an A1C above 7, they're diabetic. And these guys had A1Cs in the range of like 13 to 14, extremely diabetic. And over the course of half a year, reversed it to where their A1Cs are below 5. Like, how do you argue with that from eating nothing but meat and occasionally some fruit, which is, if you're diabetic, you're not even supposed to eat fruit.
Right.
But yet, because they're eating predominantly meat and their bodies are healing, they can eat fruit sugars just fine. And it doesn't spike their blood sugar anymore. So anecdotal evidence that I've come across and using.
I got to jump in there because I don't want the significance of what you just said to like just kind of float past. That is huge.
Yeah.
Those patients were diabetic. I mean, they were in a very unhealthy state.
Not just diabetic, but dying of diabetes, right. Slowly dying of diabetes.
Slowly dying of diabetes. So it was in a bad condition. And it wasn't years. It was in less than a year. They're back into a much healthier state. That is massive.
And changing their bodies from being morbidly obese to, by the time they were no longer my patients, once I finally left, they were already moving out of the obesity category, reducing their weight down into a normal overweight category. And I've lost contact with them, but hopefully they're down even lower. And then there was one other one who I know for a fact, she and I were very close because we worked together. She did the same thing. So actually there was a fourth one that I have neglected to include in my anecdotal study. And she actually did it in less time, 2 months. And she had reversed it was a new diagnosis of diabetes. And in 2 months she had reversed it and she's still normal. Yeah, it's amazing. So here's what, and this is what I told them, and this is how this whole thing works is, okay, I'm not saying that you have to be a carnivore. I'm not saying you have to stop eating everything that you love to eat and just eat meat. Not everybody wants to do that. Not everybody probably can do that. Plus, of the 7 billion people on the planet, there's 7 billion different attitudes towards food and food sources and what's available. And there's so many variables. So I just use some very basic, very simple rules. Have red meat be the focus of your diet at each meal. And what you'll find is you actually eat less. You end up not feeling like eating 3 meals a day. You'll probably eat closer to 2 and maybe snacking. So having red meat be the focus of your day, just eliminate vegetables, because who has ever gotten, mouth watering over a bowl of leaves? Nobody. You mouth water over everything else gets thrown on top of it, right? The candied pecans and the dressings and the oils. And so, I mean, you could get rid of the leaves and put a bowl of that together. And now look at what you're eating. And most people will look at that and be like, yeah, you're right. That doesn't look very healthy. But that's what we're salivating over. So stop eating the leaves, because nobody likes eating leaves, and start focusing on the foods that were actually designed by God to be for consumption. That's the fruits. If you're eating sufficient quantities of meat, protein, and fat, your body's naturally going to limit the amount of carbohydrates and sugars well, they are sugars, but they're the amount of carbohydrates that your body craves. And so you end up eating, your body naturally will limit how much fruit you consume. Plus, if you're eating the whole fruit, you're getting water, you're getting vitamins, you're getting the fiber that comes with the fruit that is a filler, which the body doesn't process, which some would argue, well, then you don't even need it, which is true. But for people who can't get over the fact that we don't actually need to consume fiber, fruit's a great way to consume your fiber if you feel like you need it. Plus, if you do have some digestive issues, consuming a little bit of fruit fiber is fine. It's not the same with juicing, though. If you take that fruit and you run it through a juicer, now you're only getting the sugar. You're not getting that slow absorption out of the fiber from the processing. And so, yes, then you can start having problems in your body. So it has to be whole fruits. And then eliminating everything else that has multiple ingredients. So what I do is I look at all my foods and I try to consume foods that, one, the ingredients list is only one. So that eliminates most packaged foods, right? And if I can look at the ingredients list and I recognize what it is, like, for example, if the ingredients list says, what would be a good example of like a 2-ingredient food? Like, for example, they've got these carnivore bars, right? They just got meat. Tallow. So it says beef. It also says tallow, and it also says honey, and it says salt. I know what those are. There's no other ingredients in that food. And I could consume each one of those by themselves and it would be a meal. They've just combined those together to make it something that's kind of palatable, right? So that's why the carnivore bars and those types of foods to me are fine. But it's really a whole food snack, right? It's just combining those foods together. So if you look at an ingredients list and you see things that you don't recognize or that you can't understand or that look like they came out of a laboratory, then you shouldn't be consuming it, because what's in it is a bunch of stuff that your body probably finds toxic, or at least feels like it needs to defend itself against, or just plain doesn't need to be there because it's there as a preservative. And we don't need to consume those things either. Exactly. So what do we consume then?
Many of these things, like they came from a warehouse or a lab, like you're saying.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So what we're saying is, as human beings, we're saying, well, God, you kind of did okay, but we can do better. That's what the scientist in the lab is saying about the food. That's what the whole nutrition industry is saying. Yeah, you did okay making meat, but we can make meat out of vegetables and make it better for a human being. So we're going to do that instead. That's beyond meat. Like it boggles my mind. If you're a God-fearing Christian, and you think that this lab-grown meat and these processed foods are better for us than raising a cow in your backyard and growing some fruit on your property and going hunting and bringing home some venison is worse than that, then you're crazy. You're not thinking straight, right? God did a great job on this planet. In fact, I would say he did it perfectly. So shouldn't we be looking at our nutrition sources like that as well? Like maybe he's already created the perfect thing for us. Maybe he's already designed exactly what our bodies need, and we just need to go back to finding it. We know you cannot survive on a plant-based whole food diet. If you're only eating plants, I mean, we just had this lady, she was the vegan, just died, right, from malnutrition, because she was only consuming plants. Happens all the time. She wouldn't, and here's the problem, she wouldn't consume any supplements. So what do vegans have to do? And this is why Whole Foods and these health food stores are in business, because vegans and vegetarians have to consume lab-made supplements. They can't survive without them. They have to go buy these bottles of things, and they have to take a bunch of pills every day that are their vitamins and their minerals, their supplements. But that makes no sense that we would need that to be to have optimal health. Why would God create everything that he created so that we could end up having to go buy supplements at a store? Like, that makes no sense. And people when people say, well, yeah, but if we go back to how people lived 10,000 years ago, then our life expectancy goes down to like 35. The problem is they mistake that data for actual health data. That data only reflects the fact that people died from disease and trauma. People died from infections, from traumatic accidents and injuries quickly. They didn't wait around for years with ill health. If you had poor health from whatever, from an injury, or if you developed a problem like, say, your pancreas didn't function and you had type 1 diabetes, you didn't live very long because we didn't have the medicine to keep you living long. So you died very young. But healthy people living on the normal diet back then, which was what our hunter-gatherer ancestors lived off of, which was animal-based whole food, they lived to be 80, 90 years old. We know that. We have the anthropological data to show it. So how can we not take that evidence and bring it forward to now and say, here we are in modern, with all of our modern technology, but we should still be eating the ideal diet for the human organism, which is focusing on keeping our environment clean by raising our cattle appropriately, but still eating meat, by managing our wild game better so that it's available to everybody. The new sort of effort, the push for regenerative farming, is what they used to do back then. Regenerative farming was how farming came into the modern age. We've gone and changed it because of industry. But if we could go back to regenerative farming now, we're also building the environment. We're building a healthy place to live at the same time as creating our food source, which is ideal.
Love it, man. So awesome. It reminds me, I read when I really got introduced to this idea, it was just randomly by reading a phenomenal biography on Genghis Khan and the Mongols and the way they ate. And man, they had so much strength and so much. The biographer, he wasn't making a point about nutrition. He's making a point. He's like, how are these guys able to travel for weeks and just annihilate other nations and just keep going? The stamina, the strength, all that. And he's like, it was because of what they ate. And he specifically talked about their teeth, how they all have healthy, strong teeth, and just were probably
and jaws.
Yeah, their jaws, exactly, all of it. And then the other countries went in there missing all their teeth. They're weak and depleted. They didn't have any stamina. They couldn't even resist it. And I was like, what is going on here? And it was the introduction to this whole idea. So it sounds like our family eats very similar to your family. But it's like, just if we were to give a quick list here, grass-fed beets, grass-fed meat, where you can find it, beef specifically, grass-fed butters, right? Free range or pasture raised eggs. You do the eggs as well.
Yep.
And then we do the grass-fed milk as well, as if you can.
Can you get raw milk where you're at?
Yep. Yeah. Raw milk.
So raw milk is the elixir of life. Like, I don't know if you had this experience, but I can tell, like, drinking raw milk, you can tell there's something about it. There's energy there. There's life in raw milk. Yep. And you can give raw milk to newborns. So, like, raw milk is the absolute best food that you can possibly consume as a developing child. But yet, for some reason in this country, we've made it illegal to even share it. It makes no sense. And it's a lot of it's fear mongering, right? Because we've said, well, it's because of salmonella and, you're going to spread disease. But when it's taken care of like it's supposed to be, that risk is non-existent. Yep. We do the same thing with cheese. I love cheese. I love our favorite meal is raw milk Gruyere, which you can get from Costco, which unfortunately you don't have in Portugal, but yeah, I'm sure you can probably get better cheese than we can here. And grapes. Like, that's one of my favorite snacks, right? The raw milk Gruyere and grapes. But no, we do most of the dairy. And we've eliminated all of the, not just leafy greens, but also nuts and seeds. So I don't consume anything that comes from a seed. And that kind of goes back to, if you look at your plant foods, like we talked about plant toxin, and we know that the leaves have toxins in them. So why consume them? But the rest of the plant has toxins too. Your stems have toxins, but there's one part of the plant that actually has a very, very high concentration of toxin, and that's the plant babies. That's the seeds. So when the seed is born, it usually comes out in the middle encased in fruit. So that's why fruit's okay to eat, because fruit was designed to be consumed. It was designed to actually turn into the growth medium for these little seeds. And then, of course, the nuts, they come out with a hard shell so that you can't eat them anyway. So we've got good evidence of why, but also we know from just measurements in labs that there's high concentration of toxin in the seeds, so there's no reason to eat them. There's nothing inherently healthy about it that you can't get from other foods. So therefore, seed oils. So anything that's made from a seed. So so all of your processed foods, if you just read the list of ingredients, you're going to find multiple variants of oil. But you can even go to a lot of the foods that we might eat, like, for example, some of your jerkies, your foods that might, like, say, for example, you've decided it's okay to eat maybe a little bit of potato here and there, which, I mean, I won't argue with that. My own ancestors survived for a long, long time on potatoes, right, in Ireland. So you can survive. And if somebody really, really loves potatoes, my wife is one of them, but you go to the store to get some, like, potato chips, and it says, like, organic potatoes, they're baked, and it's like, oh, okay, great. These are just potatoes and they're baked, then maybe with some salt. But you turn over and look at the ingredients list, and the first thing is sunflower oil. They're marinated in sunflower oil and then baked with that on them. So all the toxins have been added back in addition to what's in the potato. Now you've added a bunch of seed toxins to it. So you have to be really careful when you're trying to decide if a packaged food is actually worth eating or safe to eat.
Yeah. And I'm right on with everything you're saying there. I love it. And I know people are wondering, like, okay, what do I eat then? If it's narrowed down, if it's so narrow, is this, I'm going to be, I think they're afraid that it's just going to be nasty and get old. We've come up with our strategy around that, but I'm curious to what you guys do, or you just eat the same few things every day.
I love it because it's so simple. Like, I'm not one that needs variety. I'm totally fine with having a steak with some salt and some butter on it every day. And for me, it's just simple. And then occasionally I throw in some fruit when I feel like it. Amy's a little bit different. She needs some variety. She likes to have the different flavors. And actually, really all of my kids are like that. They like to have the kind of concoctions. So, like, my boys, they've figured out how to add some things in that are the least toxic. Like, my son Noah will throw in some herbs on his steak, and he'll just add some of those flavors because he knows how, but he also is recognizing, hey, if I'm only using it as a garnish, then the toxin and the poison that are found in these foods is minimal. Yep. So it's not going to affect me if everything else I'm doing is right. So the point is you always, whenever you're going to sit down to a meal, start with what's good, and then think to yourself, is there something better? And then think to yourself, what's the best thing that I could be eating right now? So if most of your life is eating good things, is following the principles of good nutrition, like we're talking about, then you can decide, well, am I okay with good, or do I want to do better? Well, I'm going to simplify my diet a little bit so that I can be better. I'm going to cut these foods out, and I'm going to have a diet that's more similar every day. What's best? Some would argue that the best thing is to eat meat and drink water and only use salt every day. Like Anthony Chafee, who's a former world-class rugby player. I don't know if you've seen him online, but he's a ardent carnivore, and he's actually the one who taught Jordan Peterson about carnivorism, and helped them with their health problems. So you know about Jordan Peterson and Kayla.
And for his daughter, changed everything.
It changed her life, and it's the same for a lot of people who've done this and taken this journey. So there is happiness in simple diets. The human body doesn't need the variety. It's our nature. I guess you kind of say it's that natural man need. It's also kind of a cultural need because we like to sit down and make food sort of a centerpiece of the gathering. So we have this need to create variety and color and all this stuff only because it appeals to other senses, not because our body needs it. So, and that's fine. That's not to say that you shouldn't do it. That's not to say that you shouldn't go ahead and add color and maybe add a little variety. Just don't do it every meal.
Yep.
And maybe don't do it every day. Simplify your diet. And there's actually, for me, it was hard at first because it felt a little boring, but I very quickly attuned myself to the boring to being normal.
Right.
To where for me, I don't need all that variety anymore. It was liberating for me to go to simplicity. And that's exactly, I mean, we're talking about our trip to Cuba. Marco has had the exact same experience. And those of you who don't know him, but Marco was the third person that was on our trip to Cuba. He's a coworker of mine, very talented media filmmaker, and Marco decided to try the carnivore diet after we discussed it, and he's basically gone through the exact same journey I did. He's just a few years later, right? And he's had the exact same experience. And now he and I are like sharing ideas of how we can travel, how we can be mobile, how we can be sort of this semi-nomadic lifestyle where we're having to go lots of different places and eat whatever's available to us, and yet still maintain this animal-based, whole food, natural, more natural diet. And we come up with some pretty unique, fun things every once in a while. But for the most part, we've been able to do that even with all the touring and traveling that we do.
And if you can travel extensively and even be in an austere environments and still maintain, for the most part, those kind of diets, then it's totally possible. It just takes some creativity. And
on top of that, you can't, if you're doing it at home, when you travel and you're not able to consume those foods regularly, your body tolerates it better. You can actually go longer without needing to get back to your normal routine diet than if you weren't. Your body tolerates being out of its place, out of its normal setting a little bit better.
That's awesome. And we've had the blessing and the advantage of traveling so much and coming across all kinds of different ways to prepare these foods. So with healthy ingredients, no toxins, no nothing. In fact, 2 weeks ago, I was in Lisbon, and we went to this fancy steak restaurant, and they brought out this meal, and we were all just salivating, just falling out of our chairs. I'm like, what is in this? And he came out and gave me the recipe, told me how to do it. And nothing
awesome.
that violates the thing. I'm like, okay, it's just a different way to prepare it.
Yeah.
The French book, same thing, to prepare it. So you're just looking at these different places around the world, and bone broth. Bone broth is one of them that's been in all these different foods and regions and countries around the world where we're like, okay, we're bringing this and we're adding it to the.
I'm glad you brought that up, Greg, because we were actually exposed to the idea of the ketogenic type of fueling. And I say ketogenic because it's very, very low carbohydrate. This way of eating, your body just doesn't consume the carbohydrates that we think it needs, which is a big problem why we have so many health problems nowadays. It's just overconsumption of carbohydrates. But my son developed epilepsy when he was 9, 10. It was 10, like between 10 and 11. And he started having seizures up to 20 plus a day. And I say we, but really this was my wife that did everything and took him to all his appointments and figured out how to help him. And at one point, there was just all the treatments had failed, all the medications had failed. We were kind of at the end of being able to treat him. And his neurologist said, look, there's one more thing that you can do. You can try a keto diet. You can get rid of all of the sugars and carbohydrates and have him be purely ketotic, which means he only consumes fat and even very little protein. It's a fat-based diet. The reason being is our bodies actually consume quite easily fat. It's the prime source of fuel, and if our bodies were adjusted to it, it's a limitless fuel supply almost. So her being who she is and had gained the trust of his doctor, typically they put kids in the hospital to put them through this diet. So they live in the hospital for months as they're going through ketosis, trying to get the brain to stop overreacting. So there's a lot of lessons there. Why? For one, why would a treatment be ketotic for the brain, right? But we saw his seizures go down significantly during the time that he was on the diet. So many improvements. We tried as a family to do it, but it was really difficult because he had to be like purely ketotic meals. So it was very simplified, but it was a lot of bone broth, and she was making bone broth every day on the stovetop. Our house smelled terrible, but that was one of the staples of his diet, was drinking bone broth every single day. Like, he was constantly drinking bone broth and these distillations of meat, basically. So the ending of this story is not that he was cured, though, by the keto diet. It only had a moderate effect at reducing. And partly the reason was because it's a very hard diet to stay on, to only consume pure fat. And we ended up having to try and find another treatment for him. But through the grace of Heavenly Father, intervening, we were actually able to find a treatment for him, a pill that worked finally, just before putting him under the surgeon's knife, which was the next option. My son actually said, and I think everything combined together just made him, attuned to that spirit. He said, "You know what? I really feel like we should try one more before I go have my head cut open." And that one more was actually the solution. And he's been seizure free since then. So I only share that because we use this type of dietary approach when we're trying to heal patients, but we think it's an extreme measure, right?
Should be
because exactly, that's exactly the point I wanted to make with it. Why aren't we doing these things first? They don't even offer this type of nutrition in the hospitals. Like, you go in there and it's purely junk food. Like, that's all that's available to you. But yet, this is the underlying cause of so much of our disease. Why is it not the first thing that we're doing to see if it works? It doesn't make any sense to me anymore.
Exactly. Oh, man. And we've even seen it a lot in direct correlation or even causation sometimes with even mental and emotional stuff. It's just.
Oh, absolutely. In fact, the GAPS, the book Gut and Psychology Syndrome, specifically talks to that, of how reducing carbohydrates and sugar, and especially processed foods, actually not only does it heal digestive disorders, which is a huge percentage of all the ailments, not to mention, we've got increasing rates of colon cancer and blah, 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 but also all these psychiatric disorders, these mental health disorders that we're trying to treat unsuccessfully or only mildly successfully with drugs. And yet, by changing diet, we're having incredible results. But do those get promoted? No, because they're not part of the pharmaceutical industry.
Okay, let's totally shift gears. Segue. I want to go. That was awesome. That was exactly what I want to talk about. We started on that in Cuba. I'm like, I got to share some of that stuff. So let's shift gears now. And again, the reason we're eating well, the reason we're exercising, the reason we're taking care of ourselves. And I know you're like this because I know the caliber of man you are, so that we can be assets to humanity. We're here to help. I know for me that is the chassis on which I'm building my entire life. I want to be an asset. I don't want to be a liability. I want to have something to offer. I don't want to have people take care of me. And so I'm staying fit. I'm eating well. I'm learning. I'm growing. And this is you do full time now and have for a lot of years. You're helping people. Let's talk about disaster relief and anti-human trafficking.
Okay. Anything specific that you want to
Well, why don't you share
Start with.
maybe some stories or why let's do with anti-human trafficking. Why did you maybe how and why you got into that and where it's going and I know it's being talked about a lot right now because of the Sound of Freedom. Um, but
Has it released there yet
no,
in Europe? It's
no.
coming.
Is it? I haven't seen it
Yeah.
yet.
It's probably gonna be released this fall.
Oh.
So you guys should be able to see it pretty soon. I just wrote an article for the World Extreme Medicine blog, and it's specifically about that, sort of calling out the medical industry for not taking more of an approach to, stop this on the medical side, because everybody interacts with healthcare at some point. So why aren't we making huge efforts in the healthcare industry to recognize it and get educated on it? So I kind of called out the healthcare industry in this little article. For that reason, it's going to coincide with a release, hopefully within the next month or two, of Sound of Freedom nearby. So you guys are going to hopefully get to see it. You haven't seen it yet, right? It's an incredible movie. Some of the stories that are in that movie, I was actually around for. I can attest to the veracity, I should say, of much of what the movie portrays. There's a lot of controversy right now because it's a Hollywood movie. And in addition to some of the truthfulness in the movie, there was also some creative license taken by Hollywood, and there's some things that happened in the movie that didn't happen, but they're based on real events. And they're also sort of taken out of timeline context. So some of the things that happened in the movie didn't happen when they happened. They were sort of conglomerations of things that happened in another time, but brought into the movie to share a better story. Yep. It wasn't ever meant to be a documentary. Right. The Sound of Freedom was always meant to be like the anti-human trafficking Indiana Jones movie, which it beat out Indiana Jones in the box office opening weekend, which was pretty awesome. But that's what it was meant to be. It was meant to be that. And I feel like it's accomplishing that goal, and I love it because Tim was my mentor. I started my work in anti-human trafficking because I met Tim, and my wife and I became friends with their family. They were actually our neighbors in Utah. Tim moved to Utah in 2012, I believe. Moved into our neighborhood, and our children became friends, and we were going to church in the same chapel. So his ward met right after ours, and we would see each other in the hallway and passing. And I had actually, and I had to remind Tim of this actually recently because I gave him some advice as a friend. I'm like, Tim, just don't forget that I knew you long before Operation Underground Railroad and your anti-human trafficking efforts in this regard. I knew you as an author, and I've cherished your friendship as an author, and for the knowledge that you've got in your brain regarding our founding fathers and how close you are to the Spirit. Because of that reason, most people don't know this, but Tim has written a number of books. The first one was called The American Covenant. It's a phenomenal book. It's his theoretical approach of why this government, why the United States of America and our Constitution even exists. And he goes through all of the evidence that are found in both scripture and what we have historically to sort of make a case for the fact that the United States is a chosen people that were designated to be a bastion of freedom and to be a location where all human beings could go to find that, as long as we are a Christian serving nation. And that is the same promise or the same covenant, you could say, that Abraham made with God, that his descendants would be followers of God and that they would worship him always, and that posterity will always do that. Well, we've made that same promise with our Constitution. So this country is to be a nation of freedom, is to be a nation of liberty, as long as we will be a Christian nation, as long as we will support Christ and prayer and godliness and all the things that we profess to believe, all the things that we talk about, when we raise our hand and cover our hearts and say the Pledge of Allegiance, and when we start meetings in Congress and the Senate, and all those things that we've been doing since the beginning of our nation. But he also wrote about.
Let me interject real quick. I just finished reading. My wife did too, and my daughter and my son's working on it. It's a new book by Eric Metaxas, and it's called "A Letter to the American Church." And he's like, he literally just outlines what you just said. It's a phenomenal book, and he's just calling them out, saying, "Look, are we going to stand up for what we believe in? Are we going to be true to truth?
Mm-hmm.
Are we going to defend it?" Right.
And that's a good question, because right now, if you look at the media, we're not.
Right.
How many of us are silent? I was reading somebody, I can't remember who it was, posted on social media. He says, was that Zuby? Do you know that guy? He's a social media influencer guy, but he says, I receive DMs all the time that say, "Hey, Zuby," he's a conservative. He says, I agree with everything you're saying. You're absolutely on the right track. We need more people saying this. I just wish I could say so publicly, but I don't want to get canceled.
Yep.
And what does that say? Because that is, I think, most people right now. They're not standing up and saying or standing firm in their beliefs by saying, "Yes, I agree with that," or "No, I disagree with that, and you shouldn't be doing that." There aren't enough people saying that. And so the problem right now is we've got this silent, apparently majority, not saying anything. So the loud minority that's really going contradictory to what most of us believe appears to be winning, or at least they're gaining power. They're gaining followers. And I think that's sort of like Satan's plan, right? If he can turn the good things to bad and make the bad things seem good, or at least get people just not pay attention to them, then he starts to win. And that's where we are in this country right now.
Even from just a purely social and civilization standpoint, all you got to do is read a little history to see that when societies and civilizations start deteriorating in some of these habit patterns and structures and these kind of problems, it never ends well. It never ends well.
And that's the problem, though, right? We're not teaching history anymore. Kids are not learning the fall of nations in school anymore. How many kids know about the fall of the Roman Empire? How many kids know about the fall of Babylon? How many kids could even tell you what it is, what they're talking about, or what was the cause of the descent of the Greek nation? Why did all these very progressive, very technologically advanced nations who existed for millennia, in some cases, just disappear? We have good evidence of why, but we're not teaching it anymore. Going back to history, when I met Tim, I met him at a book. He was giving a presentation about one of his books. He was talking about the Lincoln Hypothesis was the book that he wrote, but he was talking about how these miracles that happened during the Civil War and leading up to the Civil War that allowed for the Emancipation Proclamation, allowed for basically his hypothesis was that this was our country's baptism by fire, that this was our payment, the deadliest war in all of history, that this was our payment in blood for the sins of this nation, slavery, which is Satan's plan. Slavery is Satan's plan, right? That we paid that price with the Civil War. And when it ended and we enacted the Emancipation Proclamation, freed and made illegal slavery in this country, that was the beginning of our nation's healing. And he told the story of one of the miracles specifically. It was, I don't know if you remember this one, but it was the lost orders of General Lee that were wrapped around the cigar case and were found at Monocacy Battlefield in Maryland. I was out there training with the military, and I had read part of the book. I hadn't finished it yet, but I was out doing some training. I was I was staying in Frederick, Maryland, and every day I would go out for a run. And this one day I went for a run, and I see off in the distance this field, and there's a little barn. I'm like, wow, that's really picturesque. That's really cool. So something drew me to it. So I ran over there, and I ran around the field, and I saw the barn, and I remember running down into this grove of trees that was right next to a river, and there was a big train trestle bridge right next to it. And I had this feeling of, wow, this is beautiful. It's very picturesque. It's very comfortable, but something happened here. I don't know what. I don't even know where I am, but there's something about this place that's touching me right now. I can just feel it. And I stopped for a second, and I walked around, and I touched a couple trees, and it was overwhelming. Like I wanted to cry, right? And I started running again around the field, and I'm like, I got to figure out what this place is. And so I ran over to the barn to see if I could figure out where I was. And it turns out the barn was actually a museum. It was closed at the time because this was after hours, but it was a museum. And there was a little sign that said Monocacy Battlefield. And there was a little brochure in this little flip top little stand next to the door. And so I pulled one out and I put it in my pocket, and I kind of peeked in, and there were all this Civil War memorabilia. And it was, it wasn't a big barn, but so it wasn't much in there, but there was like a cannon and some muskets and a uniform and a case, that kind of thing. And I ran back to my room, and I was supposed to go meet my companions for dinner. And I'm about to take a shower, and I sat down on my bed, and I started reading this little brochure, and it was a map of the battlefield. And if you know Civil War history, then you would recognize as soon as I said Monocacy Battlefield, because you know that this was where the Union Army had retreated. And as they retreated across the river, 6 sharpshooters were chosen amongst the soldiers to stand behind trees on the enemy side of the river and hold off the army until the rest of the army could cross the river, and then burn the bridge. So I was standing in the spot where those sharpshooters were on a suicide mission to save the Union Army. And they all died, of course, but they held off the Confederate Army until they were able to cross the river. But what's significant about that is history tells us, had they not escaped, where they were at that time in the war, the Confederate Army could have decimated the Union Army and had a direct shot to march on Washington, D.C. So had the Union Army not escaped, that would have been the end of the war, and the South would have won. But something else happened there that was really significant. It was where, right prior to this, this was when the locked orders of General Lee were discovered, and they were wrapped around a cigar case. And what's significant about that is they didn't know if they were authentic or not. But the General Lee's aide, his secretary, was best friends with the Union General Secretary, and as they were reading the orders, they were trying to decide if they were authentic or not. And I'm totally messing up the story because I'm trying to hurry through it for you, but these 2 soldiers, these 2 secretaries were best friends. They went to West Point together. And he was able to confirm. He said, I know my friend as well as I know anybody, as well as I know my own brother, because he is. Those orders are authentic. They were the marching orders of the Confederate Army. And so the Union Army was able to redirect and head off the Confederate Army before they marched on Washington, D.C. at full strength, because they hadn't lost any but the 6 sharpshooters. So they were able to and then defeat them at Gettysburg. So that's what happened at Monocacy Battlefield. And I felt that while I was there. I was attuned enough to recognize something historical and something heavenly happened in that place. to set off events that changed the course of history, that changed what could have happened to this nation, right? So then I go home. I fly home a few days later, and I meet my wife at this. Tim was doing these book presentations. At this time, he was trying to sell the Lincoln Hypothesis book, and he had a little screen up, and he was showing kind of a slideshow. And my wife was sitting in the you were in the front row, I think, where you and I walk in, and I look up, and on the screen is a picture of Monocacy Battlefield with a little haze drifting over the grass and this tiny little farmhouse off in the distance. And I sat down, I looked up, and I saw this, and I like instantly I had this like full flashback of just being there a few days earlier. And I even told my wife, like, I was just there. Oh my gosh, I've got to tell you the story about what just happened. Of course, Tim was sharing his story, so I couldn't tell her right then, but I was able to tell her later. And that was really like my introduction to, okay, this guy is inspired. Like he's listening to the Spirit when he writes these books. He's really trying to find out what real history is and give us another option, another way to think about these things that have happened in the past and are setting ourselves up for the future. And we can listen to these lessons or we can disregard them. It's up to us. But the question is, if we're going to listen, are we listening with our human ears? Or are we trying to listen with these spiritual ears that will tell us? Like when I was standing in that little grove and I knew there was something significant there. That bridge was new. The bridge that they crossed burned. And those 6 sharpshooters died because they have no way of getting across the river. But the feeling and that spirit of what happened in that place was still there in that grove. How 200 years later is that possible? Except that God recognizes that important events in history need to be passed on. And so that spirit is going to tell us when something is important to us. He knew I needed to know that story. And so he made sure that I found a way to figure out that historical perspective. And I can tell you how many times I've told that story and I cry every time because it impacted me that much, because I learned not just history, but I learned how it affects me. And I learned how I can guide my life to be better because of the lessons that I'm learning from the sacrifices made so many years ago. So
sharing this too and making this connection, can't help but think like the slavery that happened that long ago is a dark time and not a good thing, right? In our history. And yet today, Americans are the top consumers in the sex trafficking.
Yeah, it's almost like we don't
like we're not making good choices again.
Exactly. I don't think we've made modern America has not made the connection that all we're doing is propagating the same slavery that we already made the blood sacrifice to eliminate. Yep. Americans have already paid the price. We've already made the choice. And as a nation, we fought and died so that wouldn't continue. And yet here we are. Somehow history has twisted all those lessons to one, make it hidden, so most Americans aren't even thinking about it. And those that do get exposed to the fact that slavery still exists think it's something different when it's not. It wasn't just the transatlantic slave trade that we were trying to eliminate. Slavery was rampant all throughout the world. Right. We were trying to make an example, a place where the rest of the world could see and could go to find freedom. So all it did, though, was making it illegal, made it that black market, underground, secret trade. And that's just persisted throughout the generations since then. And what we're seeing now is the industry is actually bigger than it ever was during the transatlantic slave trade. That was a 400-year industry where slaves were transported throughout all these nations across the Atlantic and across the Mediterranean, and they estimate there was anywhere between 11 and 17 million people transported across the Atlantic to the Americas, and not just the United States. In fact, very few of them came to the United States in comparison. Most of them went to the nations of the Caribbean. That's why we have what we have in places like Haiti and Dominican Republic. That's if you look from the historical standpoint, that's really why the Caribbean ended up being populated the way it is. And yet we have now between 30 and 50 million people enslaved in the world, and those numbers,
currently,
that's today. Yeah, in various forms of slavery, and of course, people like to bring up the worst, what we consider to be the worst, sex trafficking of children, but 2 million of them are children in that trade. But if you take all of the trades, they estimate, but the estimate varies widely. There's a big difference between 30 and 50 million. But when you talk to experts that are actually looking at the data from all the different sources, they all agree that these estimates are probably grossly underestimated. That 50 million is probably the low number at the least. So you look at it in those terms and you think about, okay, well, what are they enslaved to doing? Well, we do have the sex industry, and it's huge. And there are tons of women, there are tons of children, but there are also tons of men involved in that industry. But the largest...
Can I ask a clarifying question? You said 2 million. Is that 2 million for children and then significantly more for women?
Yeah. So that's just in the sex industry.
Yeah.
So that's children involved in sex slavery. So there's many, many more. I'd have to pull out the numbers to give you the exact numbers of how that is differentiated. But here's the problem with those numbers. When you start pulling out, well, there's this many women in this trade, there's this many children in this trade, and there's this many organs that have been harvested. There's another subject that we could depress everybody with, but organ harvesting is one of the up and coming terrible segments of this industry that needs to be brought to light more. But your industries, so the labor industry, the sex industry, the organ industry, labor can be divided up into other, like your indentured servitude, but we can also throw in like child soldiers, which is a big thing right now in Africa and some of the Asian regions like Myanmar and Cambodia. The problem is each of those crosses over. So you get overlap between, if you've got a woman who's in the labor industry and she's being exploited as a laborer, there's a high percentage, in fact, nearly 100%, that she is also being exploited in the sex industry. And it's the same for all of them. So even the men, right? And then we also have the industries like how do we differentiate, and how does it affect us if we look at this labor industry? Well, we like to talk about how there's sweatshops in China and there's child labor in Vietnam, and kids that are building our sneakers and whatnot. But even worse is we're all driving around. I mean, it's not lost on me that I'm talking into a cell phone that's using a battery that is made with cobalt that more than likely was harvested from a mine in an African nation. There's a good chance it was the Congo, where kids are dying every day in these mine shafts because they're harvesting cobalt. Our cars are the worst offenders. So all these rechargeable batteries that we're using to run our solar systems, to run our Teslas, those are a very high percentage of the cobalt that is used in those. And cobalt's not the only one, lithium too, is harvested on the back of slave labor. And the problem is it's very hard to track where that comes from, because these nations there's nothing controlling what's happening in these nations for the production and then the the purchase of the cobalt from the manufacturers like Apple and Tesla and lots of other, especially the Chinese. Most of those come out of Chinese manufacturers, and most of those facilities are not in China. So, we're all like focusing on, well, your ESG, we're focusing on environmental standards, but we're not paying attention to the human standards. We're not paying attention to the human cost of all of this stuff that we consume on a daily basis. Yep. I mean, every time you set that phone down on the charger on your nightstand so that your phone's all ready for the next day, so you can make your phone calls and do your work and talk to, there's a good chance that
something in your life is there on the back of some kind of slave labor.
Yeah. Some child could have died bringing that cobalt to your nightstand so that you can have an easier day tomorrow doing your work.
Okay. So what do we do about it? Right. I distinctly remember learning about U.S. history and thinking I would have done something. I would have fought back. I would have helped it, I would have helped people escape. I would have gotten involved. I went to the museum. The museum right on the river there in Cincinnati is awesome. Talking about how they were helping them escape them. And I think, I would have done that. But today, right now, there are far more in some kind of slavery than in all those hundreds of years. What can we do about it, man?
Greg, I get asked that question daily, and it's true. It does go back to, I think all of us is good, God-fearing Christian men who are managing our families and staying committed to our work and being faithful to our spouses and trying to keep, everybody and everything functioning. I think we all like to think the best of ourselves in the sense that had the opportunity arisen for us to participate in the Underground Railroad, we would have. And the reality is, I'm not sure that's the case. When people ask me, well, what can I do? A lot of times I get glassy-eyed responses because it's not easy. And when you've been touched in such a way that you feel like you want to make a difference, a lot of it is being creative and trying to figure out, well, what can I do? And in other words, not saying, well, what can you tell me to do, but more like, how can I get in this fight with my skills? So that's asking myself, what can I do? I've got to figure out how I can get involved. And that's not a question for somebody else to answer. I can certainly tell people about opportunities and things that are available to them, but to know somebody sincere, that would be the person coming to me and saying, hey, this is what I know how to do. Is any of this useful to you? That to me is a more appropriate way of trying to get involved, and a more sincere way of trying to get involved is already taking an inventory of what do I have that I think could be beneficial in this fight. And the funny thing is a lot of guys will come to me and be like, I was a badass in the military, so I know how to go out and kill people in secret. And, I would love to get involved. Well, that's useless to me, because I've never once in 10 years of doing anti-human trafficking work, I've never once gone out and found a trafficker and killed them. That's not how it works. That's not 2023, right? That's illegal, and that will probably land me in prison. So those skills are not useful. So what is it then that would be useful, like in our work with Ariel, or with the work that I did with Operation Underground Railroad, or what any of my friends are doing in these other organizations? It's what can we do to bring trafficking and slavery to the front of everybody's face so that they're talking about it, they're seeing it, they're recognizing it? I mean, honestly, to me, the number one thing that we can do to stop slavery is for everybody to talk about it, to educate every single person on the fact that their phone works on the back of child slave labor. to know that buying this Tesla may not be the most appropriate thing to do as far as ridding the world from human exploitation. Maybe there is an argument for doing something for the environment, although that's arguable. But to actually do something for human beings, for children, it probably isn't the right thing to do until we've developed a better way to hold electricity in batteries. How about for that scientist to say, you know what, I want to stop child exploitation and human exploitation in general. I don't want to have to mine cobalt anymore. So I'm going to use my brain to invent a battery that makes that not necessary. Like, those are the kinds of things that we need to be thinking about. Progressively, how do we figure out how to stop slavery is to stop having to have to use slave labor. It's the demand, right? But then you also go to what, if somebody comes to me and says, well, I was a undercover detective for the police department. Okay, now my brain's going like, okay, how can I use this? Because bringing to light and punishing all of these traffickers is definitely something we want to do. Absolutely. And there is a space for that. But man, I've been involved in these missions and going undercover and pretending to be a trafficker and putting myself in harm's way and leaving my family and getting in front of these people and saving a few kids here and there for 9 years now. The numbers have only gotten worse in that time. Nothing's gotten better. There's not less slaves in the world because of the work that I've been doing and my colleagues have been doing. So why have I been doing it for the last 9 years? And I can definitely argue that by saying, well, it was worth it to save one child. Absolutely. And I would never minimize the rescue of one child or the arrest of one pedophile, because those are really big. Those are really important things. And so I do believe that still needs to be done, and I'll continue doing it. But I think it's the smallest part of the work, because what really needs to happen is people need to be educated and we need to stop the demand. So I've only talked about labor. I mean, sex trafficking is going up. It's becoming a bigger part of the puzzle. If you take the pie and divide it up, and you've got labor over here and organs over here and child soldiers over here, and this sex trafficking component is just getting bigger. And I think there's two reasons for that. I think partly because, we're descending into Sodom and Gomorrah. In fact, past that, we're descending into Babylon now, but also we're discovering that there's more overlap. Like I was mentioning before, you've got your woman who's being forced to be an indentured servant over here, but she's also being abused sexually over here. So she's being sold to, people in the town to, for whatever. And so now we're finding that out more. And so, I think pretty soon it's just going to be this one pie, enslaved, exploited human beings. And if we allow this trajectory to happen, in 9 years, I've only seen the numbers get worse. Well, if it continues and nothing changes, what's the end result? The numbers are going up. So the end result is the whole world is enslaved at some point. Now, what does that remind you of? To have the whole world, all of its people, enslaved, being forced and told what to do. Well, that was Satan's plan all along. I will make them come back. I will make them follow you. I will make them return to heaven. That's Satan's plan. Choice and liberty wasn't part of it. So he's actually, through exploitation and slavery, this is how he is enacting his plan of controlling the whole world and making us all serve him.
Oh, so sick.
So then how do we change it? Well, we educate, we recognize, we teach, we talk about it. We demand our governments to enact laws that eliminate it, and we actually make punishments, the opposite of what places like California are doing. We make punishments for pedophiles, and we reduce the demand.
Yep.
How do we reduce the demand of sexual exploitation? How do we reduce the demand of people wanting or needing to buy sex?
I was going to ask you that one.
Well, we start punishing the buyers. I think that's a start. We start enacting laws that actually make the abusers, the ones that are going out and needing to buy it. But I think it also has to go back to how do we better teach values? How do we better teach to not objectify other human beings? And that's the big issue, right? Is these kids are being brought up in households where they're not learning those lessons. They're being brought up with with that kind of being the norm. They're even not even really being brought up with a value system, right? It's just a free for all. Yep. And then we're actually supporting an industry that is totally based on the objectification of other human beings, mostly women, and that's the porn industry. We are totally allowing the porn industry to run rampant and do whatever it wants. And all it's done is gotten more abusive, and it's gotten more aggressive, and it's gotten more gross. And it's turned into something that I don't think it ever was meant to be, right? At some point it was meant to be sort of artistic and just kind of give you some feelings or maybe even be inspirational. But that's slowly turned into something that's purely abusive. In fact, nowadays, it was only 10 years ago, they did a study of the types of porn, and they looked at what was being sought online. Do you know what half of the porn searches, when people get on and they Google, I want to watch this kind of porn? 10 years ago, 70% of it was 20% of it was anything like abusive. Half of it now is wanting to watch anal sex. Half of all porn searches right now is to watch anal porn. And it wasn't very long ago where that was a taboo subject to even talk about. And now it's half of it. So what's showing up in half of your porn videos now? A fetish. And so now we're even seeing more, that's slowly changing into other fetishes. And so we're also seeing more abuse of kids online because that's a fetish. And so we're seeing more porn being created. Did you see they just did a bust in Australia? One of the most technologically advanced secret porn sites that they've ever busted, which was just a bunch of like tech nerds had created this massive porn distribution ring, all pedophilia, all child sexual abuse material. They just busted it it was Australia and the US. It was linked to those 2 FBI agents that were killed last year when they were doing a bust on one of the sites that was holding the porn. It's in the news. I'll send you a link to it. You should read it. It's really interesting, and it's extremely sad to know how many kids would have been abused to produce that kind of material. But the other problem is it's totally accessible right now. Right. Like you can easily just get on your phone, and you don't even have to be an adult. Any child can open up any device and access porn. And they're even making it available to children who don't understand what it is. Right. And we have data proving what happens to a child's brain when they're exposed to porn before puberty. And yet we're having children that are being sexualized at 7, 8, 9 years old. And we know their brains are being changed permanently because they're being abused they're being exposed to videos and pictures they don't even understand. But yet it's changing their brain without them even knowing. It's no different than giving them a drug and making them addicted to fentanyl or another opioid, which they'll have to then deal with for the rest of their lives. It's like a child, being born with fetal alcohol syndrome. They're going to deal with that their whole life. We're doing that to these adolescents before they even have any tools to deal with it. Right. So we're creating these sexualized children who are then becoming sexualized adults who are then the ones that are doing the abusing.
Exactly, becoming predators. Oh. So, I'm glad you walked through that whole connection because it gives us those listening. That's something we can all do. Is fighting the cause. Like I like to say, like going back upstream. Go back upstream. Like what's fueling this? What's a huge part of the problem? It's a big societal problem, and we can do our part. We can all do our part and just, spread it like you're talking about and bring it to the surface, talk about it, but like fight back.
Yeah, because it's in the whole world. I mean, I just mentioned Australia, but it is everywhere. It is in every country. It is in every community. Here in the US, we are the biggest consumer of of abuse material. We're the biggest consumer of child sexual abuse material, but we are the biggest consumer of all pornography. But there's other countries that aren't far behind. And so, yeah, everywhere we have an opportunity to open our mouth and say something, and we need to call this out. We need to say, this is wrong. This is not how culturally advanced societies, this is not how, especially going back to your, the holistic man, this is not how a gentleman acts. This is not how a man of God acts. A man of God does not allow this to happen. We need to be, as men of God, calling this out everywhere we are, whether we're calling it out in our own country, yelling it in English from the rooftops, or in another country, yelling at whatever other languages we speak, that this is wrong, that this is not acceptable behavior for men, especially because men are we are the culprits, right? We are the ones that are driving all of this. And the only reason there are women involved is because they're being brought along and groomed into these. And there are bad women, don't get me wrong. I've come face to face with plenty of bad women, but most of them, and I would argue that probably all of the women who have been criminals that I've been personally involved with their arrest were in multiple ways victims themselves, right, of the men that were around them. Right. So this is our fault. So what are we doing to change it? Because even though you and I may not be porn addicts, if we stand silent when things like this are happening and we don't say something when we have an opportunity, and it could be something as simple as just making that comment on a social media post or putting in our story, yes, I don't watch porn, yep, or porn is bad, yep, or we shouldn't be allowing drag queens to dance half naked or full naked nowadays in front of our children in libraries, right? We need to call this stuff out when we see it, but we're not standing up because we're afraid. We're afraid of getting canceled. We're afraid of, even though we're not using our voice, but we're afraid of the voice we might use getting canceled. It makes no sense. And I get so frustrated because I'm just as much, I'm just as guilty as everybody else. There are times when I have held my tongue. During COVID, this is a perfect example of calling out things that are wrong when you know they're wrong, and you're not saying it. I don't want to bring up, all the other stuff about COVID, but there were some obvious things in the beginning of COVID that we had already received the data that what we were doing was wrong, but because the data showed that we were responding the wrong way. And so many people, and I'm actually very proud to say that I was one of the ones that stood up and nearly got fired. But when we started putting masks on children, that was one of the first things that we did. And this is the reason I'm telling you about this is because I think this is linked to how we're abusing children. Because the fact that we disregarded all of the data that we had, that children, healthy children, were not at risk. And yet we took them out of schools. We took them out of their safe places. Many children, the only place they were watched over was in school. We took them out of their safe places and we put masks on them to make them anonymous. And all we saw was a 9,000% increase in child sexual abuse material that was produced during that time. It's like, we know exactly why that happened. Children could then be abused without anybody noticing for a year and a half. During that time, I was very outspoken about masking children. I was very outspoken of closing schools. I almost got kicked out of the military because of what I was saying. I nearly got fired from my clinic job because of what I was saying, and they tried to minimize my voice as much as possible, but I wouldn't stop. And fortunately I didn't, but when it came time to start the vaccination push, and I knew these vaccines were not appropriate for the kids, I didn't stand up. I didn't say what I thought was right. I didn't push back and say, no, I will not vaccinate any children because they don't need it, even though now we know full well that all we did was harm them. But while I stood up for the whole masking thing, I lost, whatever courage I had during the beginning. I lost it when the vaccine started pushing out, because I was just as blinded by the falsities that were going around everywhere, and by everything that the media was saying. And I look back on that, and it breaks my heart that I didn't stand up. So going back to what you said, would I have been the person that, we all ask ourselves, would I have been the person that would have joined the Underground Railroad? Would I have done my part? If a slave showed up at my door back then, would I have kept them secret, knowing that I was putting my family at risk? And, I like to think that I would have been. I like to think that I'm that kind of a person. But just recently with COVID, for one part of COVID, I didn't. I turned away from the door. So I learned a lesson.
Yep.
In fact, I've left clinical medicine because a big part of it is because of that lesson. I lost my faith in the medical community, and I had to get out of clinical medicine. And I may go back, but for now, I've realized that I'm sort of in, I guess you could say I'm in a repentant stage, where now I'm trying to actually do my part and be part of that Underground Railroad, and try to make a difference in children's lives, to make up for a decision I made then, and to show not just myself, but also my children, my family, and anybody else who's watching, that we need to use all of our skills to fight this, because this is the war. We are in all-out war against evil right now. Yep. There is there's no other way to put it. This is a war. There will be casualties. There are people dying. There is blood. There is guts. There is everything that you would see in a real war. It's happening right now. It's just hidden. But unless we stand up, and unless we grab our muskets and our possibles bag and go run to the front lines, it's just going to keep getting worse without our involvement.
Have to participate. And man, I get it. I get this whole thing of like, I just want to live my life. I just want to go to some quiet little corner of the world with my kids, raise my little family, live my quiet little life, and not have to deal with the ugly that's out there. But I personally cannot do that. Because I feel like I have a moral obligation to do something if I can.
Yeah.
But what you're saying is like, whatever asset you have, whatever skill you have. I know many of you listening to this, one of your skills is earning massive amounts of money. So maybe you take that wealth and you fund these missions. And you and I wholeheartedly endorse Aerial Recovery. It's a phenomenal organization. And I've worked with a lot of organizations around the world, but this one's solid. So maybe it's putting the wealth there. Maybe it's some technology. Maybe it's just, you just join these organizations or speak out against porn and just bring that back down. Or I don't know. There's
Greg, let me talk a little bit to that. People that have wealth, I think a lot of times they have really good ideas of the good things that they can do with it. But just to give them an idea of just how hard this is for us to fight with the limited resources that we have. The human slavery trade is $150 billion a year industry, and that's a very low estimate, we think. We think that it's actually much, much higher than that, because most of it is, as an illegal trade, it's very hard to collect data. So a lot of this is extrapolated from assumption. So think about what type of resources $150 billion would get you. Think about how many retired NSA computer genius experts you could hire to hide your online porn addiction, or to combat your enemies who are trying to stop your child porn ring using all the latest and greatest technology that was developed by all these governments, or to hunt down your enemies that are trying to take you down, who are these little NGOs who are, mostly just people with really good hearts and a few unique skills using a taken line that are coming after you, but now you're going to turn all this wealth that you're getting from this horrible trade against these people that are hunting you down, right? I mean, if you're the predator, these do-gooders that are coming after you, so to speak. Think of the amount of resources that wealth buys you. And then you look at the other side, us, with our little organizations that are just trying our best to have plane tickets to go where we find leads to, which, just to give you an example, we've never upgraded the plane seat. So when I travel to Colombia, I'm usually sitting in the back of the plane next to the bathroom, in the seat that doesn't recline for 7 or 8 hours, because we buy the cheapest seats we possibly can, maybe on Spirit Airlines, because we don't have the money. We don't have unlimited supplies of resources. And I'm using a undercover camera that I pieced together from two that broke because I had to buy them off Amazon because I can't afford the really good ones. Or, we're saving up so that we can go down and supply $200 to the undercover investigator from the country that we're working with, our partners, just so that they can go out and do an investigative undercover operation and actually purchase information from an informant. $200. But they can't.
Which is huge for a lot of those guys. Giving context to listeners, like some of these guys down there, they're earning so little. And they're good guys with good hearts who want to do the right thing, but they're just barely surviving on these teeny salaries.
$200 is twice. So one of my partners down there, $200 is like twice his paycheck. And the Colombian government asks him to pay for his own investigations and not get reimbursed. So just to give you an idea of how it works, we'll go down and help him. I'll provide the funding so that he can go do his investigations, go undercover, pay for the information that he needs to get, so that then he can come back with all that evidence, take it to the attorneys, the attorney general, and the prosecutors, and make the case, so that then they can go back out and make the arrest. It's just a few dollars. It's pocket change to us. We don't even think twice about it. We spend $200 buying a couple things at Costco nowadays here. Yep. But to them, I mean, that's a paycheck, and that's a whole investigation. And they can take a criminal off the street.
Let me make this connection too. That $200, let's say, could be a lead to rescue a woman or a child.
That's exactly what it was. I'm not going to go any more into it, but another place that we were just recently working, that is exactly how much it was. It was $200. And I just found out that it's going to result in an arrest and a rescue of 5 children. And that was just a couple weeks ago. And so next week, they're going to do a takedown. And I can't tell you where or talk anymore about the specifics, but they're going to do a takedown and they're going to make the arrest, all because we gave them $200. That's why that $200 number was sticking in my head, because that was exactly the story that just happened.
And that's something everyone listening to this can do regularly.
Yeah, I mean, that's nothing. But here's another perspective, though. Just for us to go assist for 5 days to assist a government, a federal agency like in Colombia or in Ecuador and Costa Rica, for us to take a team down with our tech to give them the resources that they need to do an investigation, it costs anywhere from $20,000 to $40,000 just to rescue one child and to make one arrest. That's an average. So for most people, that's a huge number, right? Like, to me, $40,000 is like that's 2 cars that are sitting in my driveway, right? But for a lot of people, that $40,000 is like a donation they might make to United Way, a few times a year, and for some people, that's the gas that it costs for them to fly their plane to Aspen for the weekend. Like, there's a lot of people where that really is nothing, but that could mean freedom to a child. That could mean a criminal taken off the street. That then how many children get to experience freedom because that criminal is now not able to then abuse them in the future. So a lot of times we focus on the rescues that we didn't have to do, which, you know, we might arrest a criminal, we might arrest a pedophile or a madam, you know, or a John, and we might rescue one child or 5 children or something like that. But we always try to go back to what has this person done in the past and what could they have done in the future. And I mean, we're looking at, you know, sometimes 10, 20, 30, 100 victims now do not have to experience victimhood because that one person was taken off the street. So the investment is actually much, much greater if we look at that overall big picture perspective.
Preventing that kind of suffering. I can just picture this in my mind, Aaron, like a trafficker with plans to go grab some kids that gets busted, and now those kids are prevented from ever experiencing that. That's a very real scenario.
Well, that is the regular scenario. When you think about any criminal trafficker being taken off the street, that future scenario is always there. It's hard to put a specific number on it, but every once in a while we can, especially if we look at how many they've abused in the past, how many victims we rescued at the time, and what their access is, which we often do get privy to that information. And so, you know, every once in a while we can say, wow, we saved 100 kids this time, even though only 5 are in aftercare, because this particular brothel was, you know, look, right next door to a elementary school, and they were focusing on this age group. So how many kids did we save because we took down the brothel next to the elementary school, you know? So it's
oh my gosh. Okay, let's wrap. This is awesome. This has been so awesome and so much here. Gentlemen, those of you listening, commit. I was doing some personal writing earlier today and was writing about committing to prepare to be an asset, right? Committing to be an asset. And I think that's what we talked about here. And it's taking care of your body and your mind and your spirit. It's your own commitment to living at a higher level, but figure out what you can do. At a minimum, donate to this cause. At a minimum, and you can commit to do a certain amount every month or every couple of months, whatever. And then speak up about the problem and speak up against evil and all kinds of garbage. There's so much that we can do, and I don't know. I think we have to. I really do. I think we have to.
You know, along those lines, Greg, it's getting inspired to be committed. So doing little things like when the movie comes, going and seeing the movie. Educating yourself by getting online and looking for those resources and finding those things that are going to then spur you to action. Inspiration is not passive. You know this. I mean, this is something I'm sure you've talked about. Inspiration is active. We have to seek our own inspirations. So if you're feeling like, man, you know what, this is something I need to do, then you need to seek the inspiration to have then whatever you need to keep you pushing forward to get active in this space. I can't tell you how many times I've had to go back. It could be after a really horrible mission, after one that went bad, I've got so many stories of kids that I didn't rescue because we lost them or for whatever reason, or cases where, you know, something terrible happened to the children and you just feel so defeated. You don't want to continue working sometimes. You don't want to you want to go hide, right? You want to just leave it all and just go hide somewhere and never do it again. But then, you know, you can't. So you have to go back and find that inspiration again, find those things that make you go, okay, you know what? I can be strong. I can do this. I can work for the kids. And sometimes it's movies. Sometimes it's books. I can give you a list of books that will really get you fired up. There's documentaries that are available to watch on Netflix and Prime that are really good. If you haven't read Cobalt Red yet by Siddharth Kara, you really should. That'll give you the whole story about cobalt and our batteries and really get you fired up. But the key is that aggressive searching for the inspiration so that you can be that valuable tool. and keeping yourself inspired to do it every day.
Perfect. That's a perfect message to wrap right there. Just be committed. No, seriously, it's be committed to that. Keep fueling it. Otherwise, we're going to want to forget it. We want to go hide away. We want to just dismiss it, or we just get busy and distracted. We're so busy anyways, and it's not happening right in our immediate presence, and so it's like out of sight, out of mind. But I think you're spot on. Let's keep educating ourselves and being a force for good, so that the evil doesn't continue to triumph because good men are doing nothing. So, Aaron, thanks.
Exactly right.
Thanks for who you are and the work you do. Sincerely, thank you for the work you do, and
thank you.
And willing to suffer and endure, and the skill set you developed a lot of years to do this work.
Thank you.
I sincerely want to honor you and thank you for that, and for inspiring me and the listeners to get involved and do something that makes a difference. Well, thanks, brother.
Thank you. I appreciate that.